Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to get started here a little bit before our start time. That way I inflict as little time possible on the advertising part of this lecture today. So my name is Kevin. I am here on behalf of the Institute of World Politics, in whose building you are currently in. We are in graduate school of statecraft and national security affairs, focusing on teaching all the elements of national power. I see a few familiar faces in this room, some of whom have some experience here at the Institute of World Politics. So if you have any questions, please direct them towards me or a friendly face in this building. So without further ado, I just want to give you a brief a description of today's event, the title of the event, and as well a brief background about our speaker, who has explicitly asked that my remarks in this area be short. So I will do my best to oblige. So today's speech is titled Nuclear Deterrence in the 21st Century, featuring our speaker, Rebeccah Heinrichs. She has now been here several times, and so we have the doubly distinguished pleasure of having you back again. Thank you for coming back. I'll say very briefly, Rebeccah is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, where she provides research and commentary on a range of national security issues and specializes in nuclear deterrence, missile defense, and counter-proliferation. So, timely topic, great speaker, and a great privilege to have you all out here yet again, and for those new faces the first time. Thank you. Now, I'll cede the floor to you.
Well, hello everyone. Thank you so much for coming out right before Thanksgiving break and spending your evening when you could be headed home to think about this subject, and then hopefully to ask some good questions afterwards, and then I plan on leaving a good amount of time here at the end so that we can have a discussion. So I'm going to say some things that are somewhat controversial depending on who's in the audience, and then but hopefully I sort of get you thinking about this, get you thinking about the subject of nuclear weapons and how they fit into the current global threats the context, the global threats that we face today. And then if there's anything that sparks your interest, or anything that I don't mention directly but makes you think about, especially with what's been in the news regarding the president's sole authority to determine when to launch nuclear weapons, et cetera, then we can talk about that as well. That's the good news, bad news about what's been in the news lately. On the one hand, I'm disappointed that that the issue of nuclear weapons and whether or not the president has the sole authority to direct their employment or not. It's disappointing to see that this issue has being politicized, in my view, on the one hand. On the other hand, I'm thrilled that people are actually having a conversation about nuclear weapons and how they actually serve U.S. interests today. So the topic of my talk is nuclear deterrence in the 21st century. And how is it different today than it was given the threats in previous years? And so I hope to lay out just a few principles for you to think about as we think about nuclear weapons. The Trump administration is preparing right now what is called the Nuclear Posture Review. That's going to come out at the beginning of the year. And the last time the country had a nuclear posture review was in 2010 during the Obama administration. And this document serves as laying out U.S. policy on nuclear weapons. So you can imagine, as you think, many of you are grad students here, whenever these big policy documents come out from on behalf of the U.S. government, there are multiple audiences. The audience is not just the Pentagon. The audience is not just Congress. The audience, of course, our adversaries are going to be looking at these documents. Our allies are going to be looking at these documents, and so they're critically important for communicating what the United States plans to do and how it is thinking about its nuclear weapons. So first and foremost, what is the purpose of our nuclear weapons? The purpose of U.S. nuclear weapons is to deter what? War, okay? And not just nuclear war. We purposely leave that ambiguous. We don't say just nuclear war. As a matter of fact, during the previous administration, we had an administration that was very determined to move the United States away from relying on nuclear weapons in our overall defense strategy. This was an administration that came out in Prague, and when the president gave his big Prague speech and said that he wanted to lead the world down a path to zero nuclear weapons. In President Obama's defense, he didn't say that we were going to get rid of the world's nuclear weapons in his own term. He readily admitted that wasn't going to happen probably in his lifetime, but this was his goal. And what nuclear weapons in the world does the US government have the most control over? Our own. So if you want to lower the world's nuclear weapons, whose do you get rid of? Well, if you're President Obama, you can get rid of our own. That's what he did. He pursued the New START treaty with the Russian Federation, and he succeeded in convincing the Senate to ratify that treaty, and it did. The Obama administration did so by promising the U.S. Senate that we would fully modernize the nuclear forces that we would have left over when we comply with the New START treaty, and it to its credit, provided a lot of money towards that end. Not sufficient in my view, but it did move in that direction and did sort of hold the line in terms of what's needed for a robust nuclear deterrent, and that meant all three legs of what is called the U.S. nuclear triad: land, sea, and air. But President Obama was determined to lower the number of the world's nuclear weapons, and so he set to do that with the U.S. nuclear weapons. And then the nuclear posture review did reflect that to some degree in terms of some of the changes it made. One of the things I think is critically important to point out, because right now this administration has been getting a lot of negative coverage and a lot of negative criticism for the president's seeming willingness and favor towards his willingness to think about nuclear weapons. He's inclined to think about, he talked about modernizing our nuclear force, having the best, most robust force we can possibly have, etc. And not being explicit about not being the first country to employ nuclear weapons, sort of keeping that very ambiguous. That is not new. During the Obama administration, the nuclear posture review did not include explicitly saying that the United States would only use nuclear weapons in response to attacks. So we didn't change this. We didn't have a no first use policy. And the reason for that is if you explicitly state that the United States is not going to be the first to use nuclear weapons, or that we're only going to use nuclear weapons in response to nuclear weapons, you can incentivize or create possibly optimism in the minds of our adversaries that the only weapons they could use that could possibly elicit a nuclear response from the United States are nuclear. Well, there's also chemical, biological, and massive chemical weapons that our adversaries have. And so if we explicitly say we're only going to use them in response to nuclear weapons, then you might actually incentivize or create this optimism in the minds of our adversaries that we can use anything short of that, they can use anything short of that, and it won't elicit a nuclear response from the United States. And because we don't want to do that, even the Obama administration did not include that change during its term. And so the Trump administration, I fully expect to keep in line with that and not include anything like that in the nuclear posture review. So there is this sort of this consensus that has developed over past administrations, Democrats and Republicans, on sort of what nuclear weapons are generally for, and they are to deter war. So one of my pet peeves I like to say right off the bat is, people say, well, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee just had a whole hearing about whether or not the president has the sole authority to direct the use of nuclear weapons. We are using nuclear weapons right now. Okay? We're using them now. When we go to sleep, we're using them. When we wake up tomorrow, we're using them. Nuclear weapons are there. The United States nuclear force is there to create a calculation or to cause our enemies, our adversaries to calculate that whatever action they might deem in their own interests that could possibly elicit a response from the United States that would include nuclear weapons is not worth the cost. That's why we have them. They're also there to assure our allies. The United States has this policy of we do not want nuclear weapons to proliferate to other countries that do not currently possess them. So we extend a nuclear umbrella to South Korea, to Japan, to our NATO allies. The promise there is that they don't need to, in the case of Japan and South Korea, they don't need to have their own nuclear weapons because the United States offers a nuclear assurance on their behalf, and that includes some NATO countries as well. And of course, NATO Article 5 of NATO requires that any time one of our allies is attacked, that the United States would behave as though we were attacked ourselves, and that's the commitment we have to NATO alliance as well. And there are other NATO countries that, of course, don't have their own nuclear weapons, that the United States provides that umbrella. So what's different today? What is different today, and what is the nuclear chem bio landscape today that the United States finds itself in? And are we to the point where some of our anti-nuclear friends like to say where the United States can sort of back off nuclear weapons more, or I don't know if you all keep up with how much nuclear weapons cost. There's just a government report that came out that with new numbers saying that over the next 30 years, that the U.S. nuclear triad is going to cost the American taxpayer $1.2 trillion with a T dollars to operate and maintain and modernize the nuclear triad that we have today. And so that number often gets thrown around saying this thing is, why do we even have this thing anymore? And is it necessary? So with that in mind, that they're meant to deter our adversaries and our enemies and to assure our allies, it's important to take a look at what's happening then across the globe. And I'll start with the Russian Federation. The Russian Federation, as the United States has moved away from relying on nuclear weapons in our overall defense strategy, the Russian Federation has actually moved nuclear weapons front and center to its nuclear strategy. It got a little bit more coverage in the middle of the Obama administration in the media, and then it sort of died off again, and now I barely ever hear it. But the senior Russian leadership uses nuclear saber rattling fairly frequently. It does so specifically. It's called NATO, the NATO alliance. It's number one geopolitical foe. It has moved nuclear-capable delivery systems to the border of Poland. It has threatened preemptive nuclear use on purely defensive deployments that the United States has made and has promised to make in Europe, including the missile defense system, the Aegis Ashore site, the systems that complement one another for Aegis Ashore, including the radar and the actual interceptors will be in Poland and the Czech Republic. And Russia has threatened to use force against those preemptively. Russia is flying nuclear-capable bombers in NATO airspace. It does wargaming exercises fairly regularly against what is obviously a U.S. threat from the Russian perspective, and it is pouring lots of resources into its own nuclear program. And when the Russians modernize their nuclear force, it's not like the way the United States does it. When we modernize our own force, we're talking about patching everything up. We're trying to make it take all of the nuclear weapons, at least to this day, that we have, and our old ICBMs, our Minuteman IIIs. We just want them to have to provide that same capability. We have a new ICBM that we hope to replace the Minuteman III with, what's called the Ground-Based Strategic, the GBSD system. That strategic deterrent. What the Russians do is the Russians are creating new nuclear weapons. So they have a very robust nuclear modernization enterprise. And so it's very different than the way the United States does. The United States doesn't put multiple warheads on our ICBMs. It's called MIRVing. The Russians MIRV. So they have just a very active nuclear force. They also have 10 short-range tactical, although there's no such thing as a tactical nuclear weapon, but when I say tactical, I mean short range for the European theater, designed for the European theater. They have 10 of those for every one that the United States has. And so they have that great advantage to the United States in the theater that's most important to Russia, which is right in its backyard. And so the Russians have really moved forward in terms of relying on nuclear weapons. The Russians have also threatened in their military doctrine, and U.S. generals have testified to this in open hearings, for those who are interested. They've also made this very well known that the Russian military is willing to employ nuclear weapons in a purely conventional conflict that NATO that the Russians might view that the NATO is posing to it, that they might just use a nuclear weapon in order to get the NATO alliance to just quickly back off. It's called escalate to de-escalate. So they're sort of lowering the threshold of when they might consider, and we're not even talking about like a massive scale war. They're talking about regional conflict that the Russians just want NATO to sort of back off, so they might use a nuclear weapon to get the NATO alliance to back away. So you can see that nuclear weapons are just playing a much larger role for the Russians. Then, of course, you can move over to China, our other near peer or peer, depending on who you talk to, partner or frenemy, as you might call, however you want to describe or characterize China. And the Chinese have a nuclear force as well. It's not as large in scale as what the Russians have or the United States has, but they are building delivery systems that are highly sophisticated, meant to target U.S. assets as well. And then you can talk about what is traditionally called rogue state actors. Obviously, we have this problem in North Korea that's making all the noise right now, where Kim Jong-un is looking to acquire, it already has the nuclear capability, 6 nuclear tests, massive missile force. In this past summer, successfully tested for the first time ever a test of an ICBM that demonstrated that it does have the range to launch a missile that can reach the United States. It has also done so by testing space launches or satellite launches successfully on its own. A satellite launch is just the same thing as an ICBM launch, short of the challenging technology to re-enter the atmosphere, which is what the warhead would have to do when it descends back into the atmosphere. So Kim in North Korea has been working towards having this capability as well. And then you look over at Iran, and whether or not, I won't go into the details of the Iran deal, except just to say the purpose of the Iran deal, according to the Obama administration, was to prevent Iran from finally racing towards having a nuclear weapons capability. But even according to President Obama himself, even if the Iran deal works perfectly as planned, all it really did was move a 3-month breakout timeline of when the Iranians could break out and have a nuclear weapons capability. It just bumped it from 3 months to 1 year. Okay, that's President Obama's own words, so I won't even disagree with sort of the very, what I would consider way overly optimistic case of this actually playing out as planned. But even if you just go by his own words and how he viewed the deal, we've only delayed it by a little bit. And meanwhile, it doesn't restrict Iran's ballistic missile program, even though Iran's ballistic missile program is still illicit, its long-range program. It's not included in the Iran deal, which is why the Iranians can continue testing ballistic missiles. It doesn't violate the Iran deal. The missiles are the hard part, okay? So just like in North Korea, it had the nuclear weapons capability for a long time. Why all of a sudden is North Korea in the news right now? It's its missile program. Okay, it's the nuclear program. It's had that for a while, but you need two parts to actually threaten the United States, a country like North Korea and Iran. And it's the payload, it's the nuclear payload, and getting it small enough or miniaturized to actually deliver it on a missile. And then you need the missile capability. And the missile capability is very, very hard to do, comparatively. And that's what North Korea has been working on. And over the years, I've spent some time working for a congressman, and then lots of time now in the think tank world, watching the North Koreans. And what they do is they launch a missile, and it blows up on the launch pad, and then everybody says, "Oh, look, the North Koreans, they think they can launch a missile." And everyone laughs about how ridiculous the North Koreans are and how they're never going to be sophisticated, or it's going to be years and years and years before the North Koreans are going to figure it out. But every time they launched a missile, they learned from their mistakes. They took that technology, they adapted it to their program, and they applied it, and then they made progress on it. So that's what North Korea has been doing. Well, and I haven't even talked about the other nuclear weapon states, but I want to talk about those right now. The reason that they have them, the reason that they have pursued them, these technologies, is because it enables countries with much smaller economies than the United States, much smaller militaries, like North Korea. Just look at North Korea for a minute. It enables them to actually coerce and blackmail the United States of America with our massive military, bigger than the world has ever seen. It enables them to coerce and blackmail the United States if it's able to hold American cities at risk of a nuclear attack. So that's its goal. It's the cheapest, it's the most cost-effective way for it to do that. And so what I have argued that in the 21st century, it used to be at the height of the Cold War, it was the United States and the Soviet Union. And we had this doctrine called mutually assured destruction that we had with the Russians, or the Soviets, where if they were to launch a nuclear weapon at the United States, they were guaranteed to have one coming right back at them, and then everybody would die. It's called mutually assured destruction, or MAD. Policy was considered crazy. And so you had Ronald Reagan, who gave this great SDI speech, the Strategic Defense Initiative, where he talked about how why not have a world in which rather than we're just threatening one another with nuclear annihilation, you can actually have defensive systems. And so then that's whenever we began pursuing, just in research only, this program for a purely defensive system. So mutually assured destruction was what worked with the Soviet Union for a time, and until the Soviet Union collapsed. Today, with all of the different threats that I just laid out, and very different countries. The Chinese have very, very different national interests than the Russians. The North Koreans have very, very different national interests than the Iranians. And each regime is run by different individuals. And this is not a math problem. Nuclear deterrence is not a math problem. I had a phone conversation today in which somebody was talking about how all these nuclear powers acting rationally. And are these powers rational? And is Kim Jong-un rational? I would say yes to that question. But rational based on the assumptions and premises that he has, not that we have. In other words, Kim Jong-un is going to behave from his perspective of what is in his own national interests. That may not be what the United States thinks is his own interests, or what the United States thinks he ought to do in order to further his own interests, even if we bought into what he thinks is his own interests. Does that make sense? Americans have this tendency to think that everybody in the world is going to behave like an American. We would never do that. That's ridiculous. That will cause great loss of human life. Other countries care a lot less about loss of human life than the United States of America. Okay, a country like North Korea that would rather starve its own people than give up its nuclear missile program is not a country that's worried about civilian casualties. Okay? I don't know if y'all are following, just aside, because we've been thinking about this guy a lot in my house, but there's recently a North Korean soldier that just made a run for it. Did you see that? He made a run for it, and it looks like he might live. He was shot 6 or 7 times as he ran across the border there, and as the surgeon is doing surgery on him, now that he's been able to, he found just indications of terrible malnutrition and parasites inside it. And this is a soldier that worked for the North Korean regime. So I mean, this is and I pray he makes it. I would love for this guy to live the rest of his life in freedom in South Korea or the United States, wherever he wants to be. But the point is, this is not a regime that shares the same values as the United States of America. And that's this. I can say the same thing across the globe. The Iranians don't have the same values that Americans have. They have different national interests than the United States has. It's the same with the Russians. It's the same with the Chinese. And so when the United States thinks of what kind of nuclear force do we need to have today, I offer these few points. One, we need to move away from this idea that the goal is to shrink the U.S. nuclear force as a primary, as a sort of a primary motivator when we're thinking about our nuclear force structure. We need to get away from this idea that cost should motivate us in terms of what kind of force structure we should have. Okay? So that's what we should not do. What we should do is look at the world, look at what our current threats are and what our potential threats just above the horizon might be. We can't just look at today and plan for today, we have to plan for tomorrow. And develop a nuclear force structure that maximizes the options before the president, whoever that is, Republican, Democrat, Joe Biden, or Nikki Haley, or Donald Trump, or Kamala Harris, or who else is being rumored? Paul Ryan, I don't know. Regardless, who the president is going to be in the future, we need to provide the President of the United States with maximum options to handle the threats before us. The nuclear force has to be flexible so that we're not intentionally constraining the president. He or she needs to have a flexible nuclear force that is safe and reliable and credible to deter our adversaries and assure our allies. You start from there, you work back. Go back to the cost for a second. $1.2 trillion over 30 years to operate and sustain and modernize the nuclear triad, which, oh, by the way, even when the Obama administration wanted to move down to lower numbers, he would have loved to have gotten rid of one of the legs of the triad if he could have. He just couldn't do it. He sought advice and counsel, and he tried, and the administration would love to have gone down, and they all, at the time, to the Obama administration's credit, maintained all three legs of the triad. Because that provides us with the most credible nuclear deterrent that our commanders have been able to agree on. And so that will stay through the foreseeable future. $1.2 trillion over 30 years is about half a dozen, 6% of the total military budget. It's a pretty good bargain, if you ask me. And those numbers, I'm using like the high numbers. These are the high numbers. There's been other reports, the Air Force has done different number crunching and gotten down to lower numbers. But whenever you think about in terms of what the purpose of the federal government is, not what we'd like it to do or the goodie bag stuff, but just the basic fundamental purpose of the federal government is to provide the common defense of the American people. It's a pretty good bargain. That's about a cost. So you want to figure out what we need as a matter of policy to protect the American people, and then you want to move back from there. Because again, the goal is peace and deterring war and assuring our allies. It is not an ideologically driven goal of decreasing the world's number of nuclear weapons or of finding budget cuts. There's plenty of other things in the budget that are completely superfluous that we can get rid of before we get rid of the actual backbone of of what the Department of Defense uses to provide protection of the American people. And the last point I'll make then is because these things change, these threats change. In the Nuclear Posture Review in 2010, one of the things that the Obama officials looked at when it determined what was needed for our nuclear force structure was the current threats, and it declared that the United States was no longer an adversary of Russia. So, which I find remarkable that everybody forgets that was said, because you would think today that we've been at war with Russia since forever, and the Trump administration is the first administration to ever say that we were not at war with Russia. It was the Obama administration who, in fact, really tried to have this reset with Russia, and one of the things it declared in the Nuclear Posture Review was that because Russia was no longer this Cold War adversary of the United States, that we didn't need to have as many nuclear weapons as we did at the height of the Cold War, and that we could go down. And so we cut our nuclear forces significantly under the New START Treaty. And I would just caution, I have not argued that the United States abrogate that treaty. I don't think that we should do that. It will be up again for reauthorization or an extension, and I think that the administration should take a look at it and see if it makes sense to do so at the time. But it makes no sense at all to be motivated to cut U.S. nuclear weapons simply out of an ideological or emotional motivation that nuclear weapons are inherently bad. Nuclear weapons are there, again, in this very complex global threat environment that the United States is in now. They're there they are weapons of peace. I know it's a paradox, but that's what they are. And so we need to make sure that we're not making our force just based on the current threat situation and not making sure that it's flexible to respond to the threats of tomorrow and beyond. So I'm going to